Welcome to another episode of America's Issues. I'm Bernadette T. Vidoro, and today I have a very special guest, a patriotic American who worked dedicatedly for the U.S. government and who was betrayed by the Bush administration. Please help me welcome Valerie Plame Wilson. Valerie, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to just set the stage for many Americans and viewers who may not know who you are and what happened to you, your story. But basically, I wrote about you and your husband, Joe Wilson, in two different chapters. The first chapter in my book called Spin, Baby, Spin. And that was the chapter related to how the Bush administration sought very flimsy pieces of information to justify the war in Iraq to begin with. And one of the pieces of information that they dug up was a letter that they found from the Italian government, purportedly, that said that Iraq was seeking yellow cake uranium from the country of Niger. And Dick Cheney was making frequent visits, as I understand, and from the documentation that has verified this fact, that he was at the CIA, camped out, creating the basis to go to war in Iraq. Joe Wilson, Ambassador Wilson, your husband, had been an ambassador to several countries, including, he was the last standing ambassador in Iraq. And George Bush's father had written about him that he was a true patriot, an American who he had actually, from what I've read, he stood up against Saddam Hussein to make sure that all of the Americans got out of the embassy before the first Gulf War. An incredible patriot that had in-depth knowledge of all of the players, including the people in Niger. And so he was selected as a candidate to go out to Niger to find out if in fact it was true that Niger was looking for yellow cake uranium. He came back, he wrote a report and said this was very, very unlikely, given all of the evidence that he found. He wrote the report to Secretary of State Colin Powell at the time. And from there, I understand that piece of evidence was written in a national intelligence estimate, a 90-page report to President Bush in 2002, October of 2002, where it said the claims that Iraq was trying to get yellow cake uranium, which is a product used in nuclear weapons, was highly dubious, quote unquote, from that report. The Bush administration had received two memos to Stephen Hadley, a telephone call that George Tenet had made to George Bush, and then the NEI report. Yet George W. Bush continued to parrot this idea that Iraq was attempting to get yellow cake uranium from Niger. All right, so 6 months later, we're at war in Iraq, and Joe Wilson decides to write his op-ed piece that ends up in the Washington Post and the New York Times, where he says basically, President Bush, have you taken us to war on false allegations? At that point, we had lost 200 American lives, and all of the information seemed to be very nefarious. It seemed to be made up. You, at that point, had been an employee of the CIA for 18 years. Is that correct?
The CIA does not permit me, I'm not permitted to acknowledge that I had any agency affiliation prior to January 2002. However, at the time, I didn't say it was logical. That's a whole other story for another time. But at the time of Joe's op-ed piece in July 2003, I was a covert operations officer working in the operations group that was seeking to find WMD, although of course we had invaded by that time, and what we were doing really was debriefing the scientists as we found them.
Okay, so as I understand, everybody who has ever worked with you or known you has said that you were an officer of the Nuclear Proliferation Office that was responsible to determine which countries were seeking to get nuclear weapons at the time, and you were not, as one Republican congressional member, identified you as an over-glorified secretary. If you had been an over-glorified secretary, there wouldn't be any problem with who you were. But that's one of those very weird things that happen. I understand that you were scrubbed from the records almost, as it may be. So very frustrating. So you have this career in the CIA that you write about in your book, Fair Game. Mm-hmm. and that is available in bookstores and in Amazon, where you talk about your life story and how you came to get into the CIA, and your kind of the history behind that. So within a week and a half after your husband goes forward with this information, with his questioning, with what he knew, what he didn't find in Africa, what happened?
Joe's op-ed piece appeared in the New York Times July 6th. 1 week later, on July 14th, Joe came into our bedroom very early in the morning. The sun was just coming up, and he threw the paper on the bed, and he said, well, he did it. And I knew what he was talking about. I opened up the paper, and I read the syndicated column by Mr. Novak, where I'm described as an agency operative. And as things happen in your life, it's a shock, and in a moment I'm thinking about this career that I loved, I was so proud to serve my country, is clearly over. I'm thinking about the network of assets with whom I had worked. They are being placed in jeopardy.
When you say assets, these are people, these are contacts in countries that trust
They-
you, that you've
absolutely.
been in relationship with, that are giving you information about what's going on.
Right.
Okay,
And I'm thinking about my then 3.5-year-old twins that are sleeping in the room next door.
And
Their
the
physical
safety.
Their physical safety. So all this is going through my mind in a moment. It's a jumble. And all I could think of to do was start putting down on those little yellow sticky notes what I needed to do.
And so what were some of the first things you felt like you needed to do?
Well, of course, I contacted my boss at the CIA, and he had seen it already. And what happened, this is standard operating procedure, the CIA does a damage report, and they start pulling every case you've ever touched, every case that you've been involved with, and they're looking, because of course the moment my name appeared in the newspaper, in the syndicated column, all the intelligence services around the world are running my name and trying to place me and any assets that might be in their countries. So that's why it was so insidious what happened. It places national security and operations that have took years to build up into jeopardy.
And all for a political reason, because what happened after you were outed is that the Democrats wanted an investigation. They wanted to know who outed you, who leaked your name to the newspapers. And so this went on for months and then years, basically, about who leaked your name. And what we discovered as a result of Patrick Fitzgerald, who was a special prosecutor who the Democrats demanded investigate this, because do you mind telling us what the fine is for outing a CIA agent? There's prison.
Absolutely. It's something called the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, and it's a felony to deliberately betray the identity of a CIA officer.